This is fascinating. What about like dynamic information that's changing?
Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to partner with Carlos Mayo, a member of our Skool community, to build an OpenAI assistant with file search capabilities. While we walk through the code, I'll show you how easy it is to start writing your first line of code and start creating your first agent. And on top of that, you can add integrations like file search, upload your documents, and then get a response from the assistant. Okay, we're going to go through all that, and Carlos Mayo will be also sharing his insight as we're building this agent. Yeah, so watch this video until the end so you understand exactly how the file search system works. I'm also going to reveal some hacks that you can use alongside the file search system to make sure your assistant is secure and also using the best tools and technologies out there. Without further ado, let's get started.
Yeah, so I'm interested in learning more about AI with all the changes that are going on in the world, and like to, in a way, future-proof myself, if you will, if it's possible. And also like create something that's sustainable, at least in the midterm or long term. And my background's in education, so I'm particularly interested in creating applications in the education space and language learning. So I'm interested in everything that has to do with speech recognition and voice synthesis and things along those lines.
I'll provide you some tools and resources, how you can diagnose errors and stuff like that. But you have a solid framework, you have some kind of boilerplate code that you can use for use case. You can then customize, you can use ChatGPT, etc., to figure it out as well. But that's why, like, I learned Python from a practical standpoint. 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I was using Excel for data analysis. And I realized there was a big bottleneck. And Alex, when you were talking about the complexity of workflows and just things not being reliable, and that's the exact point where I decided I'm going to move out from Excel, from doing data analysis, and start using Python code, because that gave me more leverage. And I realized the code has already been written by other people. I just need to put the pieces of the puzzle together and then solve a problem. It saves me time, headache. Instead of working with 100 rows of data, I can work with 1 million rows of data, 1 billion rows of data. So it's like the system is different. It puts me in a different kind of bracket in terms of what I can do with my service or analytics. Now, eventually, I think even analytics can be outsourced with agents. I made a video yesterday about the code interpreter tool. With your OpenAI assistant, you could create your own data analysis agent that does analysis. You provide some feedback, or you provide some custom prompts, etc., and then the agent figures out, writes code, does some complex analysis, gives you a report by the end. So all of these things, we're getting to the point where it's going to get automated. So we're moving to better and bigger systems. So the only way I can imagine you guys getting leverage is through using the OpenAI Assistant API and Python code. Now, you tell me what you see. Okay, I know there's a lot of bits and pieces of code. It'll be great to have your eyes on like things that are challenging for you, so I can also make a note of that as I'm explaining this. Okay. We've already talked about how we can install libraries in Google Collaboratory. If you're not familiar with Google Collaboratory, it's an online service from Google where you can run Python code in the cloud for free without investing in hardware or installing Python in your computer. So we just need to install OpenAI into our environment. You played around with the Google Collaboratory, right, Carlos? Did you find that easy to use?
Yeah, it's not that difficult, and yeah, I actually have it open right now, and yeah, I see each section where you can enter the code and then the next one and so forth.
Okay, perfect. And do you have your OpenAI API key? That's also another.
Actually, no. Today, I'll do it today. I'll do it today.
No worries, don't worry. I have it plugged in, but for the audience who's watching, it's important for you to have your API key. And when you have your API key, you can plug this in under the secret section. Okay, and this is going to be only available for you and your notebooks. It's not going to be shared. So For example, I do a lot of videos here on YouTube where I share my code. The only thing I don't want to share is my API key, because that's how OpenAI charges you for your usage, and that's the cost aspect. So make sure it's always secure. And you plug this in here, and this is how we set up our environment. We have our API keys, and we authenticated our client object. So as you can see, we've imported all the functions from OpenAI. We've installed OpenAI library. We've imported the OpenAI library and tools. Then we've used one of their tool here, OpenAI, to authenticate our client object with our API key. Now, when you run the code, you can see there's two ways to know that it ran successfully. You can see a checkbox right here, the green mark. That means that it had successfully ran. And so by extension, that means that the client object is now available for you. So if you create a new section right here in the code, you just type client. You'll notice that it's a client object from OpenAI. That's how you know that it's ready for you. And then you can transition to the next block of code. So this is going to be the most important piece of today's topic, which is creating the OpenAI assistant. And creating the assistant is pretty straightforward. We use a tool or function provided by OpenAI called assistance create. We'll have the OpenAI reference here, and you'll notice they have a section under assistance, create assistance. This is exactly the process I used to create my assistant. I go to the API reference, I look at the codes that they have provided us, and then I customize it based on my needs. You can also copy this code, paste it in ChatGPT, provide some context, and tell ChatGPT to write it for you in the specific format that you want. So in this case, I told ChatGPT that I wanted a tool called file search. Carlos, are you familiar with the file search tool?
No.
Okay, that's fine. So assistance, if you go to the assistant, well, actually, you have the API reference. You also have something called documentation. So when you click on documentation, it gives you more useful documentation in terms of what is the assistant API, how can you create your assistant, how can you create a thread, what are the step-by-step process of creating your assistant. There's also a section that says how assistants work. Okay, so this is basically the assistant framework. We're going to dive into this later, but understand the assistant has access to different things in the arsenal. So when you're asking a question to your assistant, you're wondering, okay, how is the assistant answering my response? What context is it pulling from? So the inference space, or the context for the assistant, is going to be a couple of things. It's going to be the thread. Thread is a collection of messages. When you're having a conversation with the assistant, like a back and forth conversation, the assistant stores that into a thread, and it's going to use that as context. Like, let's say, Carlos, you've talked to the assistant, like you sent 10 messages already. The assistant now knows enough of what the problem you're trying to solve, and it's going to respond accordingly using that conversation or the thread. And it also has access to a couple of things: code interpreter, file search, and function calling. Code interpreter allows the assistant to run code, do complex data analysis. It does this in its own environment. And that's why the assistant framework is so powerful, because you unlock more possibilities. It's not just a question and answer knowledge-based bot. You now give the assistant more tools, like, hey, run code for me, create a report, do complex data analysis, etc. So it does that with the code interpreter tool, and then we have something called a file search. So, Carlos, we were talking about the difference between custom GPT and OpenAI Assistant API. So, have you worked with custom GPTs? Have you built a GPT before?
Like what? Like within ChatGPT?
Yes.
Yes, yesterday I created one and I added some PDFs because I'm working with languages. I used it and it was helping me, so I have some experience.
Perfect. When you're uploading your own files to the GPT, it now has more context in terms of what you're trying to solve. And with a custom GPT, it uses something called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. We can dive into the technicalities in another session, but understand that with the file search tool, OpenAI allows you to use not only RAG, but also something called a vector database, right? So with a vector database, you can scale. You can add not just one file, you add 10,000 files. You can also use the search capabilities. So your assistant can understand meanings. Let's say you say, find a section in the document that talks about a pet that is similar to a dog or something like that. That requires meaning. And the assistant understands, oh, that could be a cat, and then figures that out. With a custom GPT, there's a limitation because you have to use the exact words. So they use keyword search. Don't worry about the technicalities, but understand with the file search feature, you have access to uploading 10,000 files. You can scale your resources when necessary, and the assistant can determine meaning from your document. And then you have something called function calling, which is another tool the assistant can use. So if you want to send emails, for example, or schedule meetings, if you want to send the customer's profile or the user's profile to a CRM system like maybe Airtable or something like that, you could do that with function calling. The assistant can determine when to call these functions. Okay, you create a task. Function is similar to a task, right? Like send email, and you give a prompt to the assistant. Hey, when you're done providing information to the user, collect their email address and send them an email. So the assistant determines, okay, this is the step I need to do. Provide this information, then ask for the email address. Once I get the email address, I'm gonna call this function to send the email. So this is all what's available to the assistant. We're not gonna worry about function calling or the code interpreter today. We're going to cover the file search. Does that make sense so far, Carlos?
Yeah, two questions. So file search, will those be files that you, like when I created a GPT, I uploaded it to ChatGPT. And in the future, if you do that, like here with Colab, where would the files be? Like what files would it be pulling from?
We can upload our own files from our own computer, pretty much. Yeah, that's a good question because that's the customization piece. As long as you have your file and you have a location for the file, you can create some code right here. I've already created the code here that allows me to open up an uploader component from Google Collaboratory, upload my file, and then send it off to the assistant. So I do this with the this tool right here, create vector store, and then uploaded index files using the stream. So this is the part where I send off my file to the OpenAI servers. So this is the system you can set up, and you can do this any way you want. That's not a problem.
Okay, so they're on the OpenAI servers, the files.
Yes. So we have a file in our local computer. We'd have to send it off to the OpenAI servers for them to store it, and we can use it. Now, if you're worried about the security aspect, and that's also a concern for a lot of people, you could use your own vector database. You don't have to use OpenAI. OpenAI provides this as a service, obviously. So you're using their database, and they're going to charge you for storing their files. And but if you want to store it on your own and have more security measures in place, you can use something called Quadrant or Pinecone. These are external database vector database service providers, and you can plug them in. And I'll have more videos on how you can actually integrate that with your assistant. But for anyone starting out, understand that you can store the files in the servers and then have the assistant retrieve it and use it with the file search feature. Okay, so this is an easy path for you to start equipping your assistant with knowledge and getting it more production and making it more practical.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we going to run this block, and it creates the assistant at this point. All right, the assistant is ready. How do you know whether the assistant has been created? Well, we are creating the assistant and storing the object into a variable called assistant. So when we retrieve that assistant object, we have the assistant ID. And we're going to use this assistant ID throughout this process to basically send messages to it, create a thread, etc. So this is really important. And every assistant has a unique ID now. Carlos, if you're building an assistant for your use case, you're going to customize and configure the assistant with your instructions, your tools, everything. And then you're going to get something like assistant ID. You might not even need to build more than one, have one ID, and you can use this multiple times in whatever framework you're using. This is stored in the OpenAI servers. If you haven't used the OpenAI dashboard, I would recommend going to OpenAI and checking out their dashboard. You're going to find this assistant there, stored there, and you can actually interact with that assistant in the OpenAI playground. So once that is done, I'm going to upload my file. All right. Hey, Carlos, how many languages do you speak?
I speak to like English and Spanish, a little bit of French, and a few phrases in Chinese. But yeah, mainly like English and Spanish at a native level. And well, in school in Canada, I learned a little bit of French. And living here in Peru, like the natural next step was to apply it to language learning, having come from Canada. And yeah, I guess I like languages, so I find it very exciting to learn, like because it's linked with the culture related to that language. So I think that's very interesting. How about you? How many languages do you?
Well, my native language is Bengali. I'm originally from Bangladesh, and then I picked up English, you know, as I was a child, and also in the United States when I moved later. And then speak Hindi, of course, by extension, because Bangladesh is close to India, so you have to understand Hindi. We have a lot of influence from India. And then living in Texas, I picked up Spanish as well because, as you know, a lot of people speak Spanish there. And I've moved around a lot, traveled to different parts of South America and picked up different kinds of Spanish. And picked up some Portuguese, not so good, but just barely scraping by. And yeah, that's pretty much it. With AI, I think things are going to be a lot easier for anyone learning languages. It's going to be more personalized and give you a lot of feedback that as coaches or language teachers, it's probably hard to do and keep up with 24/7. So I think that'll be really great. So I have a document right here that's basically, now it's in a text format at this moment. It's unstructured. Okay, so it's basically, if you imagine this in a structured format, like an Excel file, it's going to be just a bunch of addresses, the city, and a few other attributes of properties. It's taken from a free source like data.gov, where I just pulled out property information. Now you can think of this like as something you can use for real estate searches or property recommendations. So yeah, so this is what we're going to use, and I'm going to bring this into our environment using this code. Okay, already there's an error. Oh my God. Invalid request, file IDs, unsupported file. In the documentation, you can go to file search, and then you can also look at the supported files list. This is where you're going to get an idea, okay, what kind of files that OpenAI accepts. right? As you can see, it doesn't take CSV, which is kind of interesting because CSV is a very commonly used format. Maybe they're going to make updates on it soon. But as you can see, when we had that error, there's nothing to worry about because there's always a way to get around. So I have another document that is a Word doc. I have a docx file. We're going to upload this. All right, so done. So when you see file counts completed 1, that means it had successfully been processed and saved in the OpenAI servers. So this is another step right here that when we're creating the assistant, notice that you can also update your assistant. There's a function to update your assistant. So you can also check out the documentation. Yeah, you can do a couple of things with your assistant. You can list assistant, you can retrieve it, modify it. This is what we're doing. We're modifying the assistant, we're updating it. You can update with new tool, maybe new instructions, etc. In our case, we've updated the assistant with a new file search vector ID. So vector ID is pretty much the vector database ID. So we created our file, created a vector store, a vector database, and we now have the ID. And we're just going to update our system with that ID. If you already have a vector store and your file already created like this, let's say this is sitting in the OpenAI servers, you have a vector store ID. When you're creating your assistant, you can actually put this as a parameter, tool resource, and specify your vector store ID. This is probably the complex part, and it'll make sense when you start creating assistants. There's different avenues you can use to configure your assistant. Okay. So we're going to update the assistant with our file search, with our vector ID, our vector database. So the assistant now has access to that file we have uploaded. This is the next step of the assistant framework. We go back to the documentation, and then we're going to look up something called how assistant work. Once we create this system, we now have to create the thread. If you already have a thread, you can reference a previous thread that you used, and we can just continue the conversation from a previous time point. If you don't, you can create a new thread. In our case, we just create a thread with the message, what properties are similar to 130 Darling Street? Okay, I'll just comment this out. Thread object is created. Now we can see the thread object. The thread object has lots of attributes, but what we need is the ID, thread ID. Every thread has an ID, so we can use that thread. Now, what's happening right now is we have so far created the assistant, we created a thread, we created a message that says what properties are similar to 130 Darling Street or something like that. This is one of the properties in that file. So as you know, file search can be thought of as a recommendation system as well. It understands similarities of not only words, but also items that you provide. So based on that property attributes, the file search feature now understands what properties are similar or far apart from each other. It could be similar in terms of distance, could be similar in terms of other attributes, whether it's like, let's say, leasing status, etc. So there's a lot of things that file search can use, and you can specify that in the message itself. When you're sending out the message to the assistant, you can say, hey, what properties are similar to this location in distance? And it's going to determine that. And that's why it's so powerful, because you don't have to worry about all the complexity that goes behind creating search systems. It's really complex. Before OpenAI came up with the file search systems, people had to configure their vector database, configure all these additional tools on top, which required a lot of coding. In this case, you take what's provided to you by OpenAI, and you can quickly create assistant and get the response. Now I'm going to show you the response from the assistant. Okay, so this is the last step, and it's very simple. The assistant is going to the file search system. This is the tool it's using, and it is sending off a response. Give it a second. It's probably thinking at this point. All right. The property located at 130 Darling Street, East Harvest, Connecticut features the following attributes, blah, blah. The property can be compared to similar properties like this, also active, leased, and built on January, blah, blah, blah. So it provided the best possible answer for the question we asked. Now, if we were to ask, hey, what properties are similar in terms of distance, it can give you that response as well. But in this case, it identified what are the similarities and also told you what the attributes are that made them similar. Okay, so that's, I would say, like a big feature with the file search. And you could, if you're like a real estate agent, or if you have a lot of properties and you want to maybe provide this as a service to your customers, like to a chatbot interface, for example, your customers can come in and ask, hey, I'm looking for a property in this area, but these are my specifications. Can you provide me some suggestions? And that chatbot can now provide you those suggestions, and that's going to boost your efficiency. Because imagine like a virtual agent having to go through all, like, we have like 1,000 properties maybe here, but imagine them going through like 1 million properties manually trying to find this out and providing that service. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, this is fascinating. What about like dynamic information that's changing, properties? So would you have to automatically update that? Like,
that's a very good question. Yeah, that's a very good question. I've been playing around with the file search system, and I found it a little bit tricky in terms of modifying already existing files. Like, you create a file and now you want to modify the file, add some new records to it. That might be a challenge, but there's ways to get around it. You can create new files. So you have a vector store, which is like a vector database. You can attach 10,000 files to it. You can have one of these files created. You can have, every time you make an update, you create a new file, new file. But obviously that's going to add to the storage cost. If you were to remove a property, it might be hard to do that. Like if you were to, like, let's say, delete a record. And that's one of the challenges. That's a good question. We've been kind of struggling with that as well. Now, OpenAI, if you're listening, and if you have a suggestion, feel free to send it my way and Carlos's way as well, as we're building these things out. I found some people use Quadrant database. So they use their own database, which gives them more customization capabilities to modify the records and add more security layers to it. Because I could imagine if you're a business, you don't want to expose all your data to the OpenAI servers. That's a big security no, So, but this is good learning experience, so you understand what are the capabilities. You could use this, take what's useful and learn from it, and then build your own Quadrant database, which is not really hard to do. You can add something with a function calling feature. You could then use the Quadrant database inside the function call, send in the relevant information that you need for the assistant to know. In that way, you're not compromising on you're not exposing your data to OpenAI servers and your security is intact. If you want more information how you can deploy this or integrate a vector database to your assistant, make sure you join the Skool community Custom GPT AI Agent Academy, where I teach you how you can create your agents really fast and add all these integrations on top of it. And you'll get the support of like-minded peers like Carlos, who's also building agents in the education space. So I think this is a great learning opportunity for all of us to learn together and use the OpenAI's tools and services, and also expand to open source LLMs and frameworks, right? I'm not against that, If you're a beginner or intermediate, you can start here, understand the capabilities, get your foundations right, build the bricks, and then expand and build the roof. That's what I advocate. So Carlos, thank you for joining this session. Hope you found this educational and valuable. And if you have any feedback and questions, feel free to share this before we close off.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you, Imtiaz. It was excellent. Like, it's really nice to know what's going on under the hood and actually start to learn this process and see how I can implement it myself to my own projects. So I'm really excited.
Really excited to have you, Carlos, in our community, and also really excited to see the MVP product that you're going to create. And we'll obviously let you guys know as well and share some of our findings as we start developing. Okay, thanks for joining. Make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to get notified every time I drop a new video, and also have guests like Carlos and other people in our show as well, have their thoughts and insights shared to you guys. And yeah, GPT Pioneers, let's go. All right, I'm done.